Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 63. And today I'm joined by Gary Park to chat about Chocolatey. And given this is a software development podcast, not an IT podcast, we're going to be talking about it from the angle of Gary's experience being involved with developing it. So welcome to the show, Gary.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this one. I've been like a long time user of Chocolatey, so it'd be nice to dig a bit under the covers about like developing it and what it's been like over the years now. It's been quite a while. Mm-hmm. So could you introduce yourself to the listeners and just tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure. My name, as you said, Gary Ewan Park. I'm a principal software engineer here at Chocolatey. I am a reasonably prolific open source contributor. I contributed to a few projects over the years. So people might be familiar with the likes of Cake and obviously Chocolatey. That's what I do. That's now my full-time job, is essentially contributing to an open source project. Now, obviously, we have a commercial side, which helps pay my mortgage, which is good. But it is at its heart an open source project and always will be. So it's been an interesting ride, let's say, in getting involved in Chocolatey right back when I first started with it, to becoming a full-time developer on it. So it's been a fun ride, and it continues to pay my mortgage, which is good. It obviously changed how I work, because I now work fully remotely from my garage, essentially. I created a small area in my garage where I could say I have a commute to work. It is out the back door and into the garage, but I still have the ability to switch off, if you like. So I shut down the machines, I close the office door, and I'm home at that point. So I've still got a commute, but that switch took a while for me. I don't know what it's been like for you if you do remote work as well. It took me a while to get into that mindset.
Yeah, I think I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and most people seem to be similar with you. It takes a while to get used to, but I seem to have just fitted straight into it. And I think I'm kind of, because I love what I do, I don't feel that I need that homework divide. It's kind of like I work from a room in my house, and it's just, I don't know, it kind of like blends together really, but I don't mind that. I think some people are against that because it adds stress and everything, but I don't find it does. So I think everyone's different really, isn't it?
I think there is an element of that. I mean, when I first started doing remote work, it was funny. My wife basically said, you can't be in the house. Because at the time she was at home with our youngest child, and she had a routine. She knew how she wanted to do things, etc. And she just said me being in the house trying to do work at the same time would not work for her, because I would interrupt her routine. And that's why we opted to essentially build an office out in the garage. And that definitely helped from that point of view.
I'm quite lucky really, because we've got 2 kids, but even there, I don't get interrupted that much, so I can close the door. And they come in like a few times throughout the day, but that's quite nice. That's one of the benefits I see.
Definitely.
If I'm in a Teams call, I can see my own webcam, and I can see if like they lean in, peer in, and then they recognise, oh, dad is in a meeting, and then they go back out again. Sometimes they like don't do that and come in when I'm in a meeting, and it's like, luckily I've got a mute button right in front of me, so I can press that and turn around and say, no, I'm in a meeting, and then they say, oh, okay, and then go out again. I quite like that actually. It's kind of nice that you get to see a window into other people's home life, really, I guess. Some people don't like that. Some people wouldn't like that. That's private, that's separate. But I don't mind that. It's like if colleagues and their like kids come in and then they put them on the knee and they say hello and everything. I think that's just nice, isn't it?
It is. It's very much, you see other people as you wouldn't normally see them. Like in an office environment, you wouldn't ever see anything like that. Being able to get an eye into what people's life is like at home, it's great. I mean, I don't have her with me just now, but normally I have my dog, Bailey, in my office. I've taken her out of the office for the purposes of this recording, but normally she gets involved and jumps on my knee as I'm in calls regularly. So she's a regular feature on our team meetings and things. But that's just, it's completely allowed. I mean, it's expected that there are going to be those interruptions, and that's one of the benefits, as you say, of remote work, being able to do that and have that essentially family time, if you like, that you wouldn't get in an office environment. And I think I said to you before, I think I would struggle to go back to an office environment now. I don't miss the commute to work at all. When I was driving backwards and forward to town, I like just being able to step out the back door and being at my office. So it's a lot of benefit to having that ability, and I really like it.
I've got a cat called, and we called him Scratch after the programming thing. So yeah, he's got a chair over there. So he kind of comes in. He's like sleeps like 99% of the time. So he just comes in, goes on the chair, and falls asleep, which is quite nice. We were thinking about getting like, should we get a dog or a cat? But then we thought we're glad we got a cat, because we thought we like the fact that he's around but not needy at all. And I don't know
Yes.
whether a dog will be like too needy.
So we have a cat as well, and as you say, it's very much he owns the house, comes and goes where he wants to, and he graces you with your presence every so often through the day. But he is very much his own person. Whereas Bailey is very much she's a cockapoo, so their breed sort of like to have attention. So she'll be sitting on my knee when I'm trying to do work, and I'm up against the desk. But it's a nice problem to have. I've always wanted a dog. I genuinely always wanted a dog growing up. Never thought, I kind of resigned myself to never having one. And then just at the start of the pandemic, my wife suggested that it might be a good idea to get a dog. And then, yeah, that's where we are now. So I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change any of it.
Nice. Yeah, we had a weird one with our cat, because cats obviously don't normally go up for walks with you. But me and my youngest went for a walk last night, and he came out and started following us. So then we went for quite a decent walk, and he was just like all the way. He wasn't actually with us, but he was kind of like just on the side, like darting. Almost like a spy that was trying to follow you. But he was like staying with us, but just suitably away from us to not be with us. But he was with us. It was quite funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, we should probably talk about technology or something software development related. Before we do dig into Chocolatey, just a quick reminder to the listeners that this podcast now has its own, well, not now, it's been for a while now, has its own Discord community. So if you head over to the website unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, there's a big Discord button there. And also the podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. So we should probably talk about saying what Chocolatey actually is before we talk about the story of developing it. I do notice, like the listeners can't see this obviously, but I can see you've got Chocolatey branding with your cap on.
I do.
Nice, very nice.
So Chocolatey is it's a package manager for Windows. So what that means is if you have a piece of software that you want to install on your machine and you want to be able to maintain that over time, Chocolatey is a utility tool that will help you do that. Why you would want to use it is, I always use the example of, let's say you want to install paint.net. Normally you'd go to the website, you'd find the application, you'd download it, you figure out what installer you need. Is it a 32-bit, is it a 64-bit, etc., or is it the Windows Store version? Once you've figured out all those things, you might be able to get the application installed, or you could just do choco install paint.net from the command line, because someone else, a maintainer of that package, has figured out all of that stuff for you. So that's what it is. I mean, and where I started using it was long ago. I was looking to create what we referred to as kind of golden images for our machines that we were spinning up. So we wanted a reliable way of getting it to a known point. So that's where Chocolatey comes in. It steps into that automation void, and it does the same thing again, repeatedly, over and over again, as we were creating those golden images. And as a community contributor, I started getting involved with Chocolatey. It's where I got my hands dirty with PowerShell when I first started using PowerShell. Some of my colleagues will tell you that I still haven't learned PowerShell, and I shouldn't ever write any PowerShell, but that's fine.
You've got ChatGPT for that now anyway, so it's...
Well, exactly. You can just ask it, yeah, what is the best way of writing this? I get told that my PowerShell looks too much like C#.
When you paste your PowerShell into ChatGPT saying, is there a best way of doing this, does it just reply saying, you should never write PowerShell ever again?
That's it. That's exactly. And it's in one of my colleagues' voices as well. They've synchronized it. It's great.
Nice.
So that's what it is. It's a developer tool that you would want to use kind of on your own, on a day-to-day basis, keeping your own machine up to date. But then organizations come along and add that into their complete software life cycle, if you like, and keeping all the machines in their fleet up to date and maintaining them the way that they want to be maintained. And when I say it's a package manager, it's not just for installing applications. It's for installing configuration. It's for installing anything that you could do as a PowerShell script. You can maintain that within a Chocolatey package, which is then versioned, and then you can maintain that version over time. So I think it's a very useful tool. Obviously, I've switched over to being, rather than just a community contributor to it, I've opted to become full-time working on it, and I have been for almost 6 years now, which has been an exciting journey to walk through that.
Nice. How do you find, so you mentioned maintainers before, so you've got maintainers for packages. So I'm presuming like a lot of software that can be deployed with Chocolatey is the Chocolatey package is maintained by people that didn't create the initial software?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you find that sometimes that gets out of date with certain packages, or how does that work with just making sure that everything's up to date, always installing the latest one?
There's a couple of aspects to that. So what you're kind of touching on there is the differentiation between what is Chocolatey. So Chocolatey for me is the chocolate.exe, the thing that you would execute on the command line. And what I think you're touching on there is the Chocolatey community repository, which is where the default set of packages that Chocolatey will consume from. So that's available on community.chocolatey.org. So that is under the hood. It's a NuGet feed. So if you're familiar with NuGet.org, community.chocolatey.org is a NuGet feed in this exact same way as NuGet.org is. And by default, that's where Chocolatey will look for and install and upgrade packages from. Now, those packages are almost universally maintained by community contributors. So they will have a vested interest in a particular application, and they've done the work to create that package and then push that to community.chocolatey.org. But there is obviously inherent delay between that, because once a application has been shipped, someone needs to come along and create a package for it. So there is a set of automatic updating scripts that a lot of maintainers use. And what that ends up being is a scheduled job on some CI system, and normally it runs every 6 hours or so, and it will run and check against the upstream application's website typically and see, oh, there's a new version, so they'll automatically run a script to generate the Chocolatey package and then push that Chocolatey package to community.chocolatey.org. So there is a delay typically for most of the popular packages, the high download rate packages. You typically see a new package version pushed to community.chocolatey.org within a few hours of the application being shipped. The only reason that might not happen is if the upstream website has changed how it announces a new version, because there's no standard way of doing that. That might be a new GitHub release, it might be a new entry on a JSON file that's stored somewhere, or it might be by scraping a website that says this is the current version of our application. So all of the automation around that is essentially, how can I reliably find what application version there is to then know to create a Chocolatey package? And sometimes that breaks because website gets updated or something gets changed. But that's where we fall back on the maintainers or the community maintainers to help us with the maintenance of those packages. So it's definitely a community effort. Without the community contributors, and there's lots of them, then Chocolatey would still exist, but the Chocolatey community repository would be lacking. But you could absolutely still, and people do this, because a lot of people have to, is they maintain their own packages in-house. So they'll have their own way of figuring out where all those things, they'll have taken all of those packages into an internal repository, and they'll never look at community.chocolatey.org. But so Chocolatey itself at that point continues to work and does exactly what it needs to do. But most people coming to Chocolatey for the first time will be looking to the community repository for their packages to get things installed, yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember like a long time ago, many years ago, I didn't do much on it, but I wrote a little Pomodoro timer tool thing. And I thought, oh, I'm going to put this on Chocolatey. So I did that, and it was quite easy to do. And I remember the package itself, Chocolatey package itself, didn't include the executables. It was more a link to the download on GitHub, so that kind of automatically did that behind the scenes. When a user did Choco install, it would download that from the official GitHub stuff. And I believe some packages might wrap up the actual binaries themselves. Is there a mix? As a package author, do you have a choice of putting the binaries as part of the Chocolatey package or linking out to like a GitHub release, I think they're called?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And what it comes down to, unfortunately, I mean, we are software engineers. It depends, obviously, right? And what it depends on is distribution rights of that thing, right? So if I was the package maintainer of Google Chrome, I, as a package maintainer, can't take the exe or the MSI and put that into a Chocolatey package because I don't have redistribution rights. So on top of the package maintainers that we have for the Chocolatey community repository, we also have a team of Chocolatey moderators who are moderating those packages to make sure that there's no violations of things like licenses. But for something like your Pomodoro timer, because you are both the package author and the application author, you could have absolutely taken that exe and put it inside the Chocolatey package. So that's what we refer to as an embedded package. And that's actually the best type of Chocolatey package, because at that point, when you do Choco install Pomodoro timer, or whatever it was called, you know that you're going to get that thing installed. There's not a subsequent follow-up call to some website that might be now resulting in a 404, or everything that you need to install that application is inside that package. So there is definitely a trend in the Chocolatey community from the maintainer's point of view to embed what they can because you get the most resilient and reliable installation of the application. There are some limits there in terms of package sizes that we allow hosting on community.chocolatey.org. So I think it's around a 200 megabyte size. If you go over and above that, then there are technical reasons why we can't allow you to submit that to the community repository. So in that scenario, you would be reaching out to the installation of that package would then say, okay, you need to go over here and download this file and put it down over here. But again, embedded packages are definitely the way to go in terms of a reliable installation of an application. Yeah.
I guess to play devil's advocate a bit, as a user of Chocolatey, I think my preference would be for, if I do Choco install, for it to download the official binaries rather than embedded in the Chocolate package. So it's kind of, I suppose it's a pros and cons really, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it depends on what side of that fence you want to land on. There are good reasons to do it one way, and there's also good reasons to do it another way. For me personally, yes, for some of the more popular packages where you're not allowed to host them, then yes, it absolutely makes sense to go off and do that. But for things like Cake, for things like Git Release Manager, for things like other tools that I'm a creator of, I think it also makes sense for me to be able to say this is the thing that allows you to have it as a Chocolate package in a reliable way. That doesn't stop me from also hosting it on GitHub releases, and it doesn't also stop me hosting it on my website as a direct download. But it just means there are different ways that I can allow people to install my application. And obviously I have a bias towards Chocolatey, but also hosting it on GitHub releases or also hosting it on my website means that other package managers can come along and do what they want to do with the application that I'm creating as well. So it's really what one works for you, to be honest.
Yeah, it sounds super flexible. So I know that, like you put in our shared notes, that version 1 came out March last year.
Yes.
And I know Chocolate has been around for many, many, many years. So can we talk about versioning?
Sure.
That's a big open question there.
So Chocolatey as a product took, let me count, it was 11 years to get to a 1.0 release. So we, Chocolatey, support or follow semantic versioning. So even before the 1.0 release, although we were shipping 0.10 point whatever, we were kind of faking the semantic version. So the minor version we were treating as a major version, if you like. So it was 0.9 point whatever. We then had a breaking change. We went to 0.10. So we were kind of following semantic versioning, but we didn't want to get to a 1.0 release until some other things had lined up. And we got to a point where we knew what we were shipping and we knew what people could rely on. And we got to that 1.0 back in March 2022. So it was a big effort to get there. But one of the reasons that we wanted to get to a 1.0 release was because Chocolatey as a product for 1.0 still compiles against or targets .NET Framework 4. So just to be clear, that's full fat framework is what I refer to it as. That's the original .NET framework. So we were still targeting .NET Framework 4.0. And there's lots of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is backwards compatibility. We still know that people use Chocolatey on much older operating systems. So while I can watch all the videos from various conferences and see what's coming out in the new land of .NET 8 as a product, we are still supporting .NET Framework 4.0. And what was interesting, I was recently at a conference. I went to NDC Oslo this year, and Isaac Levin was there doing a talk, a really good talk. But Isaac Levin started going through the audience and said, put up your hands if you're deploying to production for .NET 7, raise your hands. And then keep your hands up if you're doing .NET 6. And then he went again. I don't think he thought he was going to get as low as what he did. But I kept my hand up because I can say that we have in production .NET Framework 4.0. So it's a challenge because a lot of new stuff that's coming out that we want to use, but we can't. So we wanted to get to that 1.0 release so that we could, as a product, move down the path of getting towards using .NET Core. So once we got to the 1.0 release, we could then start breaking things because we've got to that 1.0 release. People know that that's the one that they can rely on. And then at that point, we can start looking at what do we need to do to upgrade this application to what we chose was .NET Framework 4.8. So that was a big jump up through the 4.5s. Some things did and didn't work. Some of our dependencies caused problems, but we were working towards that 2.0 release where we ship it with not only .NET Framework 4.8, but also support for people might know this who are listening to this. We also added in support for NuGet v3. So when you're using NuGet.org, there's two ways of consuming packages from NuGet.org. There's the OData feed, which is the v2 feed, and then there's a JSON feed, which is the v3 feed. So Chocolatey as a product never had support for v3 up to and including 2.0 of Chocolatey CLI. But that in itself was a major rewrite because the NuGet client libraries, I don't know if you've had the privilege of working with the NuGet client libraries, there was a fundamental switch in how those things work between version whatever. It was a massive change. It used to be the case that there was a NuGet.core assembly, which was a single assembly, did everything, and then it broke up to, I think, maybe 15 different assemblies for different things. So it's a logical change because everything's now compartmentalized and everything makes sense once you grok it. But that grokking it took a while. But that was an interesting path to go through to see, okay, we're on .NET Framework 4.0, what do we need to do to get up to 4.8? And then that starts to put us in a position where we can start thinking about what we can do to get to .NET Core, or as it's now branded, just .NET. But that is a challenge for another day. That's not a challenge that we're taking on right now. That will be V3 or V4 because there's lots of other things we want to do in the pipeline. But it's an interesting kind of debate within the team of, well, we could use this new shiny thing over here, but then our core product is still on a older framework for reasons. So it's an interesting kind of balance between what can we pull in and what can't we pull in at the minute. So it's been fun. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, especially if you go into like NDC and stuff and you're seeing people talking about the new and shiny. It must be quite frustrating. I know in your version 2 in our shared notes, you mentioned about testing, and I'm obviously quite interested in testing and things. And you put Test Kitchen and Pester, which is...
Yes.
I've heard of Pester. I've not heard of Test Kitchen before, though.
So with the 2.0 release, and because we had such a switch in the internals, we wanted to be able to be in a position where we could say with a reasonable amount of certainty that we haven't broken anyone and any of the new functionality also continues to work. So the way that you typically test applications, as you know, there's unit tests, there's integration tests, and I know that you're a fan of spinning up Docker and having Redis and SQL that you can spin up and do all, and all of that's great. So our kind of version of that is we do all our unit tests and we do some of our integration tests, but at the end of the day, we want to know that running choco.exe has the desired result. So we want to be able to spin up an environment and run choco.exe to do something and then make assertions on perhaps the output. So then that might be what gets generated. That might be what gets output at the command line or in a log file. We want to be able to assert on all of that. So what we do, we've written a bunch of pester tests. So pester tests typically are for testing PowerShell, and you would write a pester test that exercises a piece of PowerShell and again, makes some assertions on it. But within a pester test, you can absolutely run an exe and do something. So we create a bunch of pester tests around the execution of choco.exe. And then you then go to the next level, which is, well, I want to be able to control the environment that I'm spinning it up in. And that's where Test Kitchen comes in. So Test Kitchen is an ability to say, create me a VM, install a bunch of things, and then run a bunch of tests. So Test Kitchen has tie-ins for the kind of core testing frameworks, one of which is Pester for us. So there's a Kitchen Pester add-in that allows us to orchestrate and run those Pester tests in multiple environments. So we spin that up in Windows Server 2016, Windows Server 2019, and then we collate all those results back and see what happened, see what we broke, or rather, hopefully, make an assertion that we haven't broken anything because all of our tests continue to pass. So it's I was going to say it's the older way of doing things, but it's not quite the older way. Because in the new shiny way, because again, when I go to conferences, they're all talking about Docker and spinning up a Docker instance and throwing it away when you're finished with it. I'm like, oh, that's great, but Choco kind of needs to install things, and it's trying to do something. Some of those things you can't do in a kind of headless environment that is Docker, because as soon as you try and run something that requires a user session, Docker doesn't have that, so it can't install and it fails. So we kind of have to install on a full VM, and Test Kitchen is a mechanism to get to, here's our base VM, which for us is an AMI in AWS. We'll spin up that AMI, We'll install what we're trying to test, which is the latest version of Chocolatey, and then we'll exercise all of those tests through Pester. So it was for us, it was a big introduction to pulling all those things together to get to a point where we could test everything to know that when we went from between, because at this point, we're now at a major version. As we're going to 2.0, we know we're going to break some stuff, but we want to know what we've broken, as opposed to shipping a version 2 and then people coming to us and saying, well, this doesn't work anymore. We want to know what doesn't work, and we want to know what does work. That's kind of why the 2.0 release took as long as it did, is because it wasn't necessarily the code changes that we were doing. It was, let's make sure that we haven't broken anybody. So that was an interesting journey to go kind of start to finish and get our own internal infrastructure in place, because how can I say this in a nice way? When we first started at Chocolatey, or when I first started at Chocolatey, it was kind of me and a couple other people. So they let me loose doing operation stuff, right? And I was spinning up VMs and I was creating infrastructure and I was doing all this stuff. And I thought it was great, right? And then we got an actual ops team who threw it all away and said, we can't do any of that stuff because you haven't done it properly. So now that we've got the ops team in place, all of our infrastructure is in a much better place than it was before. So a lot of the behind the scenes work for what is a open source project is now multiple teams delivering and trying to get that to a point where we can ship it. So again, that's been an interesting journey to go from me and a couple other people just doing everything to doing things in a much more structured and understood way of doing things. So yeah, that's been an interesting journey as well.
I can imagine, especially seeing a small company grow and having like suddenly ops teams come in. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, with the testing, that's quite interesting actually, because as you say, I kind of like, cause I do a lot of like API kind of development, so that makes sense to spin up a database in Docker or whatever. But then obviously, as you say, with Chocolatey, that's the outcome of what the requirement is installing software into an operating system. So it's kind of that is I've not heard of this test kitchen, but that sounds like really useful. But yeah, it's just another thing for my long list of things to read up on.
It's one of the tools. It's under. It's from Chef. That's where it comes from. So they've got a bunch of tools, and Test Kitchen is one of those. Now, under the hood, Test Kitchen might be using Vagrant to spin up VMs, and there's different providers where you can run it. So I can run Test Kitchen locally on my machine and execute all the tests. And at that point, I'll be using Vagrant as a provisioner for spinning up the VMs on my machine. But where we run it on our CI system, Test Kitchen is orchestrating Vagrant to use the AWS provisioner. So all the VMs are spun up in the cloud. But at that point, it's not agnostic to one particular way of doing things. You can define the provisioners within Test Kitchen to say, okay, spin the VMs up locally or spin them up in the cloud. It's quite flexible from that point of view. Doesn't always work, I'll be honest. It's one of these, because there's so many moving parts, and we start talking about a WinRM connection to the VM coming and going or not being created in time to do all the provisioning that needs to happen, and there's getting information out of the logs for it is difficult. I know at least a couple people on the team would testify to that. But once we have it in place and once it does run, the comfort level that you have for shipping a product becomes much better, because you know that you've got this suite of tests that are happening on it in the background to make sure that everything is continuing to work the way you want it to. And it's really nice when you do get a failure, because it's something that you have missed, but you also know that you've caught it before it went out the door. So it's that kind of comfort level is increased when we have all of this testing and infrastructure in place. But it's also one of those things that we've only just changed it, actually. A lot of the pester testing along with Test Kitchen stuff, that was all done internal. Just recently, we have moved the Test Kitchen and pester tests into the Chocolatey open source repository. Before, all of that pester testing and the Test Kitchen testing was done inside our own infrastructure. But we have recently moved it into its own repository. The idea being now that as you're making changes to the source code for Chocolatey.exe, you'll also be extending and configuring the pester tests at the same time. So they're not two separate scopes of work. Everything happens at the same time. And the idea is that hopefully open source contributions, when they come along, it won't just be a code change. It'll also be, oh, here's a new pester test, or here's a modification to the pester test, so that we can know that that new piece of functionality that's coming in has been tested in the same way that we want to do it internally as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. On the other side of that, so you got the test making sure that your changes are working. Do you have, I'm asking this because I'm kind of like more recently getting more and more interested in observability and telemetry and open telemetry and all this kind of stuff. Do you track and have telemetry over errors that an end user might face or how many, like all this kind of stuff?
So I was going to say unfortunately not, but it depends on who you are. So Chocolatey has no telemetry. It's straight up, it doesn't have any. That was a decision that Rob Reynolds, the founder of Chocolatey, made right back at the start. So there's no concept of phoning home. The only sort of traceability that we do have is if you're running choco.exe on your machine, you'll do choco install, whatever, we'll see that incoming request for the nupkeg, the package to CCR to be downloaded. But that's the only information that we have. We don't track anything else. So we know that someone is installing a package, but we don't know who it is. We don't know where it's going. We don't know what they're doing with it. So there's little to no traceability whatsoever. And that is, I see that as a benefit, because if you're installing applications on a machine or you're upgrading, I personally don't want that information going somewhere into the ether. People don't need to know what I'm using and what I'm running locally. So other package managers do make that decision and they decide that they want to be able to track things like that. But we as Chocolatey don't. So that's a double-edged sword, because at that point, we can't see the errors that people are having. So we're relying on them creating issues, or if it's from a customer that's coming to us, they'll raise a support ticket. So when we did the 2.0 release, there was quite a few, let's call them teething problems. And that's maybe why you'll recognize that we're now at a 2.2.2 release, because there were a few things that we had to fix after the initial 2.0 release. But all of that came from feedback that we got from open source users and customers, because we don't have any traceability in terms of exceptions being thrown when the tool is actually being used. We do have, and we're starting to look at traceability and observability for some of our infrastructure applications, but Chocolatey itself, no, there's nothing in there.
Yeah, as you say, it's a bit of a double-edged sword where it's kind of, in one way, it'd be nice for like seeing if there's errors, but in another way, it's nice to say, we're not sending any information about what you're installing from a privacy point of view.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of, I'm just thinking back to when you were saying about Vagrant as well. That's been such a long time since I've used that. I remember like many, many years ago, before Docker kind of like got as popular as it is now, and it was a bit, let's say, more flaky. I use that quite a lot. It's like with a whole Vagrant up, just running Docker within like a VM instead. But yeah, it's been such a long time, so that brought back memories.
I mean, I was literally just before we came on to record this session, I'm doing Vagrant ups because we're away to ship a new product release. So I'm doing Vagrant ups on our environments here. And I always hear talk about people doing Docker Compose and doing all these things. I'm still doing Vagrant ups, but at the same time, that can be a multi-computer environment. That's what I've got. So when I do Vagrant up here, it's actually spinning up 4 or 5 machines that are all kind of talking to each other, and I'm using that for testing purposes. But ultimately, at some point, some of our infrastructure and some of the stuff that we want to do will be moving to the likes of Docker, because we can run those workloads in a container as opposed to having to have it as a full VM. But it's kind of, at the same time, it's also nice to be able to kind of see where things have come and to see where they're going as well. So yes, still using Vagrant because it worked for us. I'm not going to say it's perfect. You kind of hinted at the fact that it could be flaky. It still can be flaky. But for the most part, at least on my machine, again, some of my colleagues have more issues than I do. I'm kind of lucky in that point of view. But it's the age-old problem of, well, if VirtualBox has just shipped a new version, then Vagrant might not work with Vagrant. That I'm actually pinned at a specific version of Vagrant at the minute, because if I update it, bad things start happening. It's a known issue between Vagrant and VirtualBox at the minute. So that's a different problem to have as well. But yeah, I mean, it's where we are. It's like I say, the technology stack that we're using and the target audience for Chocolatey, it kind of needs us to use that sort of testing infrastructure and functionality compared to, again, as we said, all the new things that I learned about at NDC Oslo when I was there. But I can also see in a distant, through the tunnel, if you like, I can see that stuff coming. So it's exciting to see it coming down the pipe. Because like I say, not so much from Chocolatey EXE point of view, but the infrastructure side of things where we have to do stuff. We've started playing with SQS and SNS and AWS so that we can do messaging and all that sort of stuff. It's things that Chocolatey as a product doesn't need and will likely never have. But I still get to play with it on the back end side of things and kind of try and keep up to date with what is available and what can be used. So it's exciting times in terms of what we're creating there as well.
Just it wasn't Vagrant I was saying was flaky. It was Docker at the time I was using it. So
I see. Gotcha. I see what you're saying.
I'm on Windows, so I leverage Vagrant to actually just run the Docker stuff inside there.
Gotcha.
But I think in my PowerShell profile scripts, I've still got aliases for Vagrant. I've got like V for Vagrant, so I can do V up.
Yes.
I've got the whole like D for Docker, DC for Docker Compose, DN for .NET, G for Git. So I've got a whole bunch of aliases to make things quicker. But yeah, I think Vagrant's still in there as well. So
it's a useful tool for what it does. I mean, it's like I say, at the time and now still, it's what we need in order to build up those environments that you need to test. So it's absolutely the tool that we need and the tool that we use.
Cool. So we are probably running closely out of time, but what's coming in V3?
So V3 of Chocolatey, we've definitely got some plans. There's no firm plan, so obviously things change and priorities change, but we are actively looking at what we need to do in terms of support for .NET, the new .NET. There's potential some issues for us in and around that. So for example, we sign all of our Chocolatey artifacts. So Chocolatey.exe is signed. All of the Chocolatey license extension is all signed. I know that there are some issues with regard to signing and referencing of strong named assemblies when you move over to .NET. We haven't dug in yet to figure out exactly what needs to happen there, because internally within Chocolatey.exe, we do a lot of reflection, and that's how we bring in the Chocolatey license extension. So again, I haven't wanted to look at that area yet because I feel it's going to be here be dragons. There's going to be things that we need to figure out. So that's definitely a roadmap item, and I have started playing with the likes of the .NET Upgrade Assistant that will, if you click a button and it'll automatically update you to .NET. That's not going to happen for us, but it might get us part of the way down the line. But there's also I have a fairly strong idea of what I want Chocolatey to be in terms of kind of a single pane of glass across your computer. So not just knowing what packages you've got installed. I kind of wanted to know what .NET Global tools you've got installed, what Windows features you've got installed. So if you were to kind of do a Choco export, if you like, of your machine to bring it over to a new machine, then it would bring all of that information across and then provision that machine to kind of be at the exact same point. So I think we've got all the building blocks for all of that within Chocolatey now. So I want to see that being extended and being able to take that across the entire environment that you're running. But for me where we are right now, there's also kind of commercial things that we're working on. We're shipping new releases of our Chocolatey Central Management, and there's some exciting stuff coming down the pipeline at that point. So although I'm working for an open source company, there are kind of priorities in terms of the commercial aspects as well. But again, it's a balance between the open source version and what we can provide for our commercial customers as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. As you say, you've got to pay a mortgage too.
Yes. That's what it comes down to. Yeah.
With the upgrade assistant, was it Isaac Levin you mentioned before?
It was. I was at a talk with Isaacs at NDC Oslo, yeah.
Yeah, so he did a talk at .NET Docs for the user group I run, and he was talking about like upgrading old versions of .NET. So yeah, he was demoing the upgrade assistant, which you just mentioned. And what was the other one? Was it Amazon? AWS?
Yes, there's an AWS tool that will do it as well, yeah.
Yeah, so he's demoing both of those. But yeah, as you say, it's kind of in a demo where it's been practiced and rehearsed first and it just works. That's one thing. On a real project.
What I suspect is going to happen for us is that Choco.exe by itself, in all likelihood, will just work. But once we start talking about Choco.exe loading in the license extension to bring in some of those commercial aspects to it as well, that's where we're going to start having problems. So that's the route that we haven't gone down. We haven't tried to do an end-to-end build of both Chocolatey and the Chocolatey license extension working on .NET. But there have been some community efforts to get Choco.exe itself compiling and running on .NET Core. And that part does work, but it's the other part that we haven't investigated yet.
Yeah, I guess that's the nice thing about open source and stuff, if you can have community efforts just doing parts of the work for you as well.
Well, I mean, just to circle back a little bit, the uplift to .NET 4.8 and the ability to use NuGet v3 feeds, a lion's share of that work was done by a community contributor by the name of The Cake is a Lie is his handle on GitHub. He did a phenomenal amount of work to get us to a point where we could even think about providing that functionality. And then kind of where we picked it up and kind of got it over the line was, here's all the testing infrastructure, here's all the stuff that we need to do to make it work. But it was the lion's share of that work was a community contribution. And it was great to see that functionality coming in and being provided by the community.
Very cool, very cool. So before we move on to dev tips, was there anything else that we've not covered?
I don't think so. No, it's been a good chat. I've enjoyed it. I think we've covered all the things that I was hoping to kind of talk about. So no, it's been good fun.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm going to look through my software that I've got installed and see what's on Chocolatey that I'm not using Chocolatey for, and see if I can tidy up. Because I think I've got my list of Chocolatey packages source control somewhere, so I just need to make sure that's up to date.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's what we find people doing is that they've got their own script that they maintain, or they might have a packages.config file that they maintain, and then at that point, it is just Choco install that thing, and your machine is hopefully back up to where you need it to be. So that's kind of the aim. It's where it all started from, and it's still kind of the core tenet of what Chocolatey is and what we're hoping it can provide for people.
Nice. Shall we do dev tips?
We can. So I did have one because I know that you're a fan of keeping things short and sweet on the command line and having shortcuts for everything. So one thing that I use is we do a combination of both GitHub and GitLab. So we have both repository systems in play. And for whatever reason, GitHub refers to a pull request and GitLab refers to a merge request. So when you start using the GitHub command line tool and the GitLab command line tool, one talks about a PR and one talks about an MR, which is just wholly confusing, right? But both of those utility tools, both of those command line tools have the concept of aliases. So you could do, for example, rather than doing GHPR checkout, you could create an alias for just GHCO. So you do a checkout with the GitHub command line tool. But you can also do an alias for PR to change it to MR and vice versa. So for me, I can now do GHMR and do GLab MR, so I can refer to it as the same thing rather than having to conceptually change from pull request to merge request depending on which environment I'm targeting. So from a consistency point of view at the command line, it makes things a lot easier. But you can take it to the nth degree where you could just have GH, like I say, CO, and kind of reduce those command lines down to what you need it to be.
I've never used GitLab before. Obviously, I've used GitHub quite a lot, and I use Azure DevOps as well, and they both use the term PR, pull request. I've never heard of merge request before. That's a new one.
So I think conceptually, if you think about it in terms of what you're doing, when you are asking someone to do a pull request, what you're actually asking them to do is to merge it. So depending on how you think about it and which side of the fence you look at, both terms make sense. I think it was just one of those kind of distinguishing factors between GitHub and GitLab. It's something to delineate the two, but it's a source of confusion. I've settled on pull request everywhere. So when I refer to a merge request in GitLab, I'm saying pull request, but that's just how I've settled. So I can make the command lines now consistent, if nothing else.
That's a good point, actually, with I've never thought about the term pull request. It doesn't make sense, really, does it? As in, you're not requesting someone pull something that's like, can you go to your computer and pull? No, you're saying, can you accept my changes into the main branch? So it is a merge request. But yeah, I use that term daily many, many times, and I've just never stopped and thought about the term.
That's it. But like I say, because it was first, because from my vocabulary, pull request is the one I've always used. It was definitely a change to start talking about a merge request. So I've accepted pull request as what it is, but under the hood, they refer to it as something else. And but like I said, the command line, I can now be consistent and keep things short and sweet, which is good.
Nice. So my dev tip is, this is a testing library. We're sticking with the testing theme that a colleague actually recently introduced to the team. It's called BDDFY. BDDFY, and it basically it adds nice fluent syntax to your tests where you can do the as a whoever or a given when then kind of syntax, and it's like you've got two options. You can do attributes, or you can do like your test with attributes each step, or you can do and I prefer this way, like just the fluent method calls, almost like LINQ.
Gotcha. Yeah,
and I prefer that method, and it's just, I wasn't sure about it at first, but then once I gave it a go and it clicked, it's cleaned up a lot of my tests. It's like really nice syntax. You've got the output as well, the text output of your tests. It formats it really nicely. If one of these steps fails, so you can do like given, when, and something, then, or something, or that kind of thing. And if any of those steps fails, then in the text output, you can see which one's passed, which one's failed, because it kind of encourages you to be more functional with each of the bits. So you'd write very small functions, because each of in this fluent syntax, it's a lambda which calls You could inline it, but generally you're calling another one of your private methods. So each of those bits you make really functional, maybe using an expression body member, so it's really small. And so that makes it naturally very reusable. So you can have more like different test cases, having different given when then scenarios, but reuse these private methods. And it ends up just being really nice as well. So that's mine. I will link to that in the show notes. Cool. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out to you if they have any questions?
I'm GEP13 pretty much everywhere that I can get it. If I've chosen to use a particular social media platform, I try to get GEP13. So Twitter or X is GEP13. I do have a Mastodon account, and I do have a Blue Sky account, and I do have a Threads account. I don't use them all. I'm still kind of on Twitter at the minute. I haven't actually left Twitter. I know there's some discussion about where to go, etc. But yeah, GEP13 pretty much everywhere that you can find people.
What does the 13 mean?
It's one of those age-old things. So when I was back in Academy, I was creating my first email account, and it was, you need a username. So I was like, well, GEP, obviously, Gary Ewan Park. And at the time, 13 was my lucky number, or what I referred to as my lucky number. So it was GEP13. I may or may not have an alter ego on GitHub that is GEP31. So if I've ever need to do something that I'm testing something, I need another account. I've also got a GEP31 kicking about somewhere as well. But yeah, GEP13 pretty much everywhere.
So your secret GitHub secondary username is now public.
It is. I mean, it's one of those. It's not a malicious user. It's literally if I need to. Why do I do it? I was trying to create. I was trying to test one of the other tools that I work with is Git Release Manager, and I was trying to do some testing of what it would do under a different user account. It's like, oh, I need to create something that's I'll remember. It's not just a throwaway account. I want to have it to be able to do stuff. And yeah, GEP31 is what's stuck. So that's me as well, if you find it on GitHub.
Nice. I'll include links to all those, including your alter ego GitHub in the show notes. And you're on our Discord now as well. So I will add you that guest role so you appear at the top of the list of members. And Perfect. Yeah, awesome. Well, with that, a massive thank you for joining me on the show. It's been great fun. And as I say, I'm going to start just reviewing my Chocolatey scripts to make sure I've got most of my apps on there.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thank you.
That's all right. And thank you everyone for listening. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all the social stuff too. And we will include links to all the stuff we've mentioned today on the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.